As World War II's flames dimmed, the world didn't step into peace, but teetered on the edge of a new, shadowy standoff that would define the latter half of the 20th century. The gap between the victorious Allies quickly widened into a gaping chasm, with the United States and the Soviet Union stepping up as champions of capitalism and communism, respectively. This division set the stage for a unique ideological showdown, influencing global politics and seeping into societies worldwide. In the midst of this emerging conflict stood George F. Kennan, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow, whose deep insights and forward thinking about the Soviet Union would profoundly influence international relations. Kennan was more than just a diplomat. He was a visionary thinker whose works became the cornerstone of America's approach to the Cold War. In 1946, his long telegram to the State Department unveiled the Soviets' playbook, providing the West with its first in-depth look at Soviet ambitions. Following up in 1947, under the alias X, Kennan delved deeper in the sources of Soviet conduct in foreign affairs. His writings didn't just break down the Soviet strategy, they rang the alarm for a strategic counter, paving the path for what we'd come to know as the containment policy. Kennan's revelations came when the world desperately needed clarity on the Soviet threat and a solid plan to address it. The impact of the long telegram and the X article was monumental, offering analysis and strategic guidance that would steer American foreign policy for generations. Through Kennan, the U.S. found not just a sharp observer of the Soviet Union, but a master strategist whose ideas on containment would anchor the West's Cold War playbook. George F. Kennan's analysis of the Soviet Union, as articulated in his long telegram and expanded upon in his X article, paints a picture of a regime deeply entrenched in ideological convictions and driven by an inherent sense of insecurity. Kennan observed that the Soviet leadership viewed the world through a lens shaped by Marxist-Leninist ideology, which posited an inevitable conflict between capitalist and socialist systems. This worldview was not merely a political posture, but a deeply held belief that influenced every aspect of Soviet foreign policy and internal governance. Central to Kennan's insights was the notion that the Soviet Union's aggressive stance on the international stage was rooted in its leaders' perceptions of capitalist encirclement and internal vulnerability. The Soviet government, according to Kennan, operated under a siege mentality, believing that it was constantly threatened by external capitalist forces seeking to undermine or destroy the socialist state. This belief system justified, in the Kremlin's eyes, a foreign policy aimed at expanding Soviet influence, and a domestic policy characterized by strict control and repression to maintain the Communist Party's grip on power. Kennan also highlighted the Soviet Union's strategic use of propaganda and its efforts to exploit divisions within and between capitalist countries. The goal was to weaken the West's cohesion and resolve, thereby easing the perceived encirclement of the Soviet Union and advancing its global influence. At the same time, the Soviet leadership sought to present itself as the vanguard of global socialism, championing the cause of oppressed workers and colonial subjects against their capitalist oppressors. Despite the outward confidence and assertiveness of Soviet policy, Kennan discerned significant vulnerabilities within the Soviet system. He pointed out that the USSR's ideology and its consequent foreign policy stance were based on premises that were not only unfounded, but increasingly contradicted by international developments and the Soviet Union's own experiences. The insistence on a binary conflict between capitalism and socialism, the inevitability of capitalist collapse, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence were all called into question by the realities of post-World War II geopolitics. Kennan's analysis suggested that the Soviet Union's internal contradictions and its rigid adherence to an outdated ideological framework would eventually limit its capacity for adaptation and innovation, both domestically and internationally. He argued that understanding the Soviet Union's motivations, recognizing its strengths and weaknesses, and adopting a firm but patient stance could contain Soviet expansionism without resorting to war. In sum, Kennan's portrayal of the Soviet Union emphasized the interplay of ideology, insecurity, and strategic calculation that defined its approach to both domestic governance and foreign relations. His work provided a foundation for the policy of containment, advocating for a nuanced understanding of the Soviet challenge and a long-term commitment to resisting Soviet pressure through political, economic, and military means, all while avoiding direct confrontation. In his groundbreaking analysis, George F. Kennan laid bare the nature of the Soviet Union, and from this deep understanding, proposed a strategic blueprint for the United States that would shape the Cold War's diplomatic landscape. Kennan perceived the Soviet regime as fundamentally driven by an entrenched ideology that viewed the capitalist world as irrevocably hostile. This perspective, combined with the Soviet Union's inherent insecurities and its leaders' ambition to expand their influence, necessitated a unique response from the West. Kennan advised a strategy of containment, a term that would become synonymous with the United States' approach to the Soviet Union and its global aspirations. This wasn't about rolling back Soviet power or engaging in open confrontation. Instead, Kennan argued for a patient, firm stance that would prevent further Soviet expansion and gradually erode the foundations of their power. He believed that the Soviet Union's own internal contradictions and inefficiencies would eventually lead to its weakening, provided the West could maintain its unity and resolve. This strategy called for a multifaceted approach, involving economic measures, political alliances, military readiness, and a robust counter-narrative to Soviet propaganda. Kennan emphasized that the West's response should be calibrated and adaptable, reflecting the nuanced understanding that the Soviet threat was not monolithic and would change over time. Kennan's prescription was clear. The United States needed to brace itself for a long-term struggle, one that required not just material resources, but also a commitment to the values of freedom and democracy. This approach advocated for strength, not just in military terms, but also in the moral conviction of American society and its allies, ensuring that the West remained a beacon of hope and resilience in the face of Soviet aggression. This strategic vision underscored the importance of intellectual and ideological engagement in the Cold War, highlighting that the battle against Soviet expansionism would be won not only on the physical frontiers of geopolitical conflict, but also in the minds and hearts of people around the world. George Kennan's strategy of containment didn't just shape the Cold War. It became the cornerstone of America's global stance against the Soviet Union, influencing decades of U.S. foreign policy and actions. Kennan's insightful analysis and recommendations provided a blueprint for navigating the treacherous waters of a bipolar world, where the ideological clash between democracy and communism took center stage. Containment was more than a policy. It was a mindset that permeated the United States' approach to the Soviet threat. It meant building alliances with like-minded nations, as seen in the formation of NATO, a military alliance that promised mutual defense against aggression, essentially encircling the Soviet bloc with a ring of democratic solidarity. The Marshall Plan, another embodiment of Kennan's ideas, aimed to rebuild war-torn Europe, fostering economic recovery and stability as bulwarks against communist expansion. Kennan's strategy also underpinned the United States' involvement in various conflicts and standoffs, from the Korean War to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the principle of not just containing but also strategically competing with Soviet influence was evident. The U.S. engaged in proxy wars, espionage, and a race to the moon, each a reflection of the broader strategy to limit Soviet expansion and demonstrate the superiority of the democratic capitalist model. At its core, Kennan's containment strategy recognized the Cold War as a marathon, not a sprint. It required patience, resilience, and the strategic application of power. This long-term approach helped prevent direct military confrontation between the two nuclear-armed superpowers, steering the world away from the brink of catastrophic war. The significance of Kennan's strategy extends beyond its immediate Cold War context. It showcased the power of strategic thinking and diplomacy, emphasizing the role of ideology, culture, and economics in global affairs. As we navigate today's complex international landscape, Kennan's insights remind us of the importance of understanding our adversaries and crafting nuanced policies that address both immediate threats and long-term challenges.